The environmental sciences have documented large and worrisome changes in Earth systems, from climate change to changes in nutrient cycles and the depletion of natural resources. These global environmental changes have potentially large negative consequences for future human well-being, and it also raises questions about whether global civilization is on a sustainable path or whether it's consuming too much by depleting vital natural capital. Well, joining us now to speak on this and also the tripartite interactions between COVID-19, the environment and the economy, with a focus on the ideal post-COVID-19 economic recovery pathway for Nigeria, is environmentalist Stanley Ijeoma. Welcome to the show, Stanley. A very good morning to you. I mean, it's no secret that it was a World Environment Day on Friday just gone. And I wanted to ask you, as the world prepares
on the 5th.
Yes, exactly, on June 5th. So as the world prepares, here in Nigeria, for example, we're getting ready to reopen society, reopen businesses and places of worship. What do you think we can expect from a life in terms of environment? What do you think we can expect for Nigeria in terms of its post-COVID-19 experience as it pertains to the environment?
Yes, thank you, Femi and OJ, for having me here. The COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted the global economic and financial systems, as well as the global health systems. And you will expect that the post-COVID-19 recovery, most governments are going to be having this knee-jerk approach to go back to the to the old way of, approaching development, which is just from a narrow point of view, where politicians will start telling you about the importance of the economy. But from evidence that we have in the last 2 decades now, we are beginning to understand that the environment is actually, the economy anchors on the environment, and that the economy is a subset of the environment. So any economic recovery post-COVID-19 would have to mainstream this reality. So the ideal economic recovery pathway for Nigeria, and I dare say the rest of the African countries, will be to mainstream economic sensitivities into the post-COVID-19 recovery. So that's the way to go. It's important that governments do not use a knee-jerk approach to jump over the economy. the environment in pursuit of economic objectives. We have seen that when we mainstream the environment into economic growth plans, that we have much more better outcomes in terms of health, which is the first beneficiary. Public health and health system, they are the first beneficiary of investments in the environment.
Well, thank you very much, Stanley, for stating that, which is a very important fact, that you said that the global health system has been disrupted, especially in Nigeria. Now, what sort of government policies can the, environmental policies, rather, can the government adopt to help curb this disruption in the health system, especially in Nigeria? The shock that was the shock to the global economy and the shock to the Nigerian economy that was triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the weakness or the weaknesses in our health system. So the best approach is for us not to deviate, and in fact, for the government to muster more political will for us to keep to the terms of our nationally determined contributions, which was part of the building block of the Global Paris Climate Change Agreement adopted in 2015. So we already have the INDC, the commitments we've made to the global community through the INDC as one of the signatories and of the Paris Agreement. So even though we haven't really seen, we are not at the point where we will say that we are meeting those targets that we already set. So the opportunity now is for the government to double or triple its political will in terms of getting the economy to the economic recovery pathway to move towards meeting those targets. Of course, one of them is the NDC that we have now looked at 5 priority economic sectors, and each of them, it also recognized that the health system will need to be much more resilient to be able to adapt to the global climate disruption. So the most important thing now is for the government to also realize that as we are moving away from the COVID-19, we'll be moving right into the climate crisis. For instance, heat waves. How are we going to isolate from heat waves? Have we made investments in trying to map urban heat islands within the city centers and within the cities that you have a lot of population and you have less forest cover? So these are some of the specific things that we need to look into as we go, as the government rolls out the post-COVID-19 economic recovery plan.
Stanley, you've talked a lot about, in your answer just then, about the support that you've received in terms of people understanding the importance there is in an environmentally healthy Nigeria. But if you were to look at the challenges, what have been the biggest challenges in Nigeria achieving that side of its potential?
Yes, it's the ignorance at the highest level. Political leaders, especially at the state and local government levels. So that's where, because this requires a top-down approach. Without political will, people will still see environmental issues as marginal, as things that are quite abstract. So we need to get the political leaders, get them in one room and try to bring them up to speed and say this is very, very important. You often hear politicians telling you that their focus is on the economy. No, few of them will tell you that they are going to mainstream the environment into economic growth and infrastructure development plans. So that's very important for us.
All right. Thank you for saying that.
The biggest obstacle is the lack of political will, and this is also what is reinforcing that is ignorance of political leaders. We cannot really do anything if we don't have that political will at the highest level. Now, that it's better at the federal level. When you take a step down at the state level, I mean, most people who are assigned environmental, the Ministry of Environment portfolios at the commissioner at the state level, most of them know little or nothing about the environment and how the environment even impedes or impacts the development. So this is something that is very important.
Right. Like you naturally said, most of them don't really know much about the environment. Well, the theme almost for this year's World Environmental Day was how to preserve nature. And obviously, nature goes hand in hand with our economy. And we do have a lot of nice natural resources. Now, how can we tap into that to help boost our economy?
It's for us to realize that when we maintain nature, preserve biodiversity, that we are actually improving our health systems, we're actually improving our well-being. So it's just for us to be sure that we are not allowing corporations and private interests overrun public goods, destroy public goods. So, for instance, the forests. Our forests are depleting. Our forest cover is depleting at a very fast rate that you'll be. That is very scary. And what this means is this forest cover that will provide some ecosystem services that there are no other alternatives for that. The forest cover or the trees provide the oxygen that we need to be able to stay alive. They also filter the air so we can have better
Stanley, I'm just air quality. Gently interrupt you there. These are the things it is time for us to take a very short break. When we come back, we will continue this conversation. Please do stay with us. Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. We are still joined by environmentalist Stanley Ijeoma. Stanley, thank you for waiting for us there. Before we went on break, you were answering Oji's question on how we can transform our natural resource wealth to benefit us environmentally. If you could finish that point before we move on in our conversation.
Yes, I was trying to make the point that we need to tighten our environmental laws. For instance, at the state level. So we see that we make sure that companies pay heavy fines when they pollute our water. Because most of the health, the burden on the health system at the state level, most of them are waterborne. They're triggered by poor quality water that people drink. So we need to tighten environmental laws at the federal level, at the state level, and make sure that companies and individuals who violate these environmental laws pay heavy fines, which will now be reinvested into planting more trees and securing more water pathways and making sure that we have cleaner water to drink and better air quality to breathe.
Yeah, well, I'm happy you mentioned that. I wanted us to not so much change the topic, but kind of switch gears a little bit, because you've spoken at length about what needs to be done from the top down. But if we were to look at the grassroots level and focus on what the everyday Nigerian can do to promote the environment, I wonder if you had any thoughts on the state of plastic pollution here in Nigeria. If you take a stroll on the street just outside of our studios, you'll see the gutters filled with plastic bottles. So there has to be a certain level of responsibility the everyday person has to take in the betterment of our environmental standing. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, we haven't invested. We need to empower people with information. When you empower people with information, then they will now know the risk that their business as usual approach to living poses to their health and to the health of their immediate community. So we haven't done that. People need to know. People need to have this information. So the government, at the federal, at the state, at the local government level, the first thing we need to do is to empower people with this information. When they are empowered with that information, then now the next stage is to create incentives. Because as you can see, and as we know, government creates the stage for economic activities. So when this stage is laden with incentives, then we are going to see people latch on to those incentives, and that could also lead to behavioral change. For instance, are you going to have people keep their plastic and return it at a certain point in exchange for some kind of economic rebates? For instance, if in a year, if you're able to return this quantum of this volume of plastic, you are going to get this kind of rebates. You're going to get free healthcare for your children, or you're going to those kind of small incentives. So that's what will lead to that behavioral change at the scale that will make a difference.
All right, I wanted to touch a little bit on climate change. I know that you said, you mentioned earlier about, policies in terms of, making sure that the government understands the risk that there is with climate change. Now, can you just emphasize that point you were making earlier?
About climate change, yes. Of course, yes, you know that Nigeria has this three-dimensional extreme exposure and high vulnerability to climate change. At the extreme north, desertification and droughts, which has wiped away the Lake Chad in the north, and in the extreme south, where you have the littoral states, the coastal states, you are having accelerated sea level rise. So what this means is we are having displacements in the north and displacements in the south, and there is a movement towards the middle belt, which also could be used to explain the increased violence or clashes between indigenous communities and
pastoralists, who are moving, and displaced people who are moving away and coming to the center. So you have this competition, intense competition, which is getting violent now for food, fuel, and fiber. So we need to dimension these pressure points very well, and now use policies to reduce the pressure on the people and on their livelihood, create alternative livelihood for those places, those communities that have been displaced by this climate crisis. So we really need a holistic approach, and that has already been documented in the nationally determined contribution, which President Buhari submitted to the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, in the lead up to the adoption of the Paris Climate Change Agreement. So already we have made a commitment to reduce to tackle some of these issues, notably to reduce our emission stock without external help by 20%. And if we get external help, we're going to reduce this by 45%. So we need to, in the post-COVID-19 economic recovery, we need to rechannel our energy to, meeting those targets. Because when we keep to the terms of those documents, those commitments we've made, then we'll be able to address some of these issues.
Well, Stanley, before the COVID-19 pandemic really wreaked havoc on Nigeria, as it did with many countries around the world, there are definitely plans and conversations being made about Nigeria's fourth wave of its industrial revolution, and how manufacturing and all of these areas of diversifying our economy away from natural resources was supposed to happen. They have been ongoing, definitely, but it does seem to be at the detriment of the environment, because when you look at instances like the Niger Delta, for example, grave degradation happening there, but then also in Port Harcourt, there's also the issue of soot and air pollution. So how do we navigate the space of wanting to industrialize, wanting to progress, wanting to invest in different areas of our economy, but still keep our country environmentally healthy? How do we navigate that space?
There's scientific evidence that investment in the environment yields manifold returns on the economy. It leads to sustainable, better economic outcomes. For instance, who can quantify the loss to the GDP of the soot crisis in Port Harcourt? How many lives are we incinerating in pursuit of so-called profit and so-called economic objectives? And who are the people that will benefit from the economic growth and development of the country? So you are incinerating the people, you are sacrificing the people on the altar of so-called phantom economic growth. So it doesn't make sense. And we don't need to repeat the mistakes of the other parts of the world where they focused on, they focused on that narrow objective of meeting economic objectives. And they discovered that they were losing more to their GDP from the budgets, from the high health spend. So now we have that advantage that we've seen what is happening, and that there is also some global incentives for economies in transition, developing economies like Nigeria, to latch on to those incentives. For instance, climate finance, for instance, carbon finance, to be able to invest in the incremental cost, because there is an incremental cost in doing this transition from the brown economy to the green economy. And the incentives are there. We need to we need more climate change knowledge management for these people to see the risk and also see the opportunities. For instance, the industry, the private sector, that information is also not there. Or not there at the scale that you will now begin to see these companies on their own, without prompting by the government, without the government wielding regulatory the big stick, then on their own begin to pursue these incentives for them to now develop invest in their plants or in their facilities that will now be emitting low carbon, so that they can reduce the emission stock and contribute to the national goal of reducing the 20% without international help, or 45% with international help. So again, we have to get the government, which is the crown. We have to get the private sector, which runs the town. We have to now get the people in our ivory towers who are wearing the gown, get these people on the same page, get them to sit at the round table to define our economic growth and development objectives that will be indexed to the environment. So that's the way to go. There are incremental costs, but again, there are also incentives that would help to reduce the burden of these incremental costs on the people and on the companies and on the communities. So that's really what needs to happen. We need to engage more. We need to get these actors together, bring them on the same page, that this is where everybody's heading to. Because what's happening now, most people, because of this, the lack of knowledge around these issues, so the academic institutions, the government policymakers, and these people are not really working. That synergy is not there at the scale that we need to make changes.
All right,
that we need to see to reverse the tide of the climate crisis.
Thank you, Stanley. Very quickly, I just wanted to touch on renewable energy really quickly. The benefits, what can we get? What can the government get from using renewable energy? Basically, 30 seconds if you have.
Yeah. Yes, manifold benefits. The low gestation period. If you want to have solar panels on your roof, today that will happen because you have almost 40% of the population not having access to the grid. They don't have access to electricity. So the renewable gives us that advantage to scale things up in record time.
Thank you so much, Stanley. I'm sorry we'll have to cut this short. We have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on The Morning Show.